We were snowed in at the ski lodge when someone cut the power and said, "No one gets out alive until one of you confesses." The voice came through the intercom, distorted and electronic, and the 7 of us stopped laughing about Henry's birthday cake and stared at the speakers like they might explode. "You know what you did," the voice continued. "You have 2 hours to tell the truth or I start shooting." Then the lights went out. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in that horrible green glow that made everyone look dead already. Outside, the blizzard was so thick we couldn't see past the windows, and we were 40 miles from anybody who could help. "This is a prank," Mia said, but her voice was shaking. "Someone's messing with us." That's when the kitchen window exploded. Glass everywhere, snow rushing in, and we all hit the floor screaming. Another shot took out a lamp right above Oliver's head. "Jesus," Walker said. "Someone's actually out there." My whole body was shaking and I couldn't stop it. We'd come here to celebrate Henry's 18th birthday, just our friend group from school, and now someone with a rifle was outside in a blizzard trying to kill us. "Confess what?" Elena asked, crying now. "We don't even know what they want, but we all had secrets. Things we'd done that we'd never told anyone." My stomach turned thinking about what someone might know, about what I'd helped do. The temperature was dropping fast without power. I could see my breath and my fingers were already going numb. The wind outside sounded like screaming. "Okay, fine," Walker said. "Last month I hit someone's car in the parking lot and drove off. Maybe they want insurance money?" The intercom crackled. "Wrong. 90 minutes left." Another window shattered upstairs. Ice and snow poured through the house now. "I cheated on the SATs, Elena admitted quickly. "Paid someone to take them for me." "Wrong," the voice said. "I've been selling my Adderall," Oliver said. "Like a lot of it, to half the school." "Wrong." We were freezing, terrified, confessing our sins to a stranger with a rifle, and none of it was what they wanted to hear. I stayed quiet because my secrets weren't the kind you admitted out loud, especially not the one from last year. "This is insane," Henry said. "Give us a hint at least." "You all know," the voice said. "Stop pretending you don't." That made everyone go quiet because there was one thing we'd all agreed never to talk about. One thing we'd buried so deep we almost believed it hadn't happened. My hands were trembling, and not just from the cold. "What about the party last year?" Scarlett said quietly. "What about Rachel?" Everyone went silent. Rachel Sanchez, the girl who died in a car accident last spring. Except we all knew it wasn't really an accident. I remembered her face that night, how confused she'd looked, how she'd kept saying something was wrong. "We promised never to talk about that," Mia whispered. "Well, someone's talking about it now," Walker said. The intercom came on again. "Getting warmer. 1 hour left." I couldn't breathe. The night Rachel died, we'd all been at a party. She'd been drinking because of what we did to her, the rumors we spread, the video Oliver took, the lies we told to break up her relationship. We'd destroyed her life as a joke, as entertainment. But there was more, something worse that only one of us had done. "She drove off that cliff because of us," Elena said. "We don't know that for sure," Henry said, but his voice was weak. Another shot, this one hitting the door. We could hear footsteps on the deck now, circling the house, but never staying in one place long enough to track. "We have to tell them everything," Oliver said. "That's what they want. If we admit it, they might kill us," Henry said. "They'll kill us anyway," I said, finally speaking, my voice cracking. The temperature kept dropping. Ice was forming on the inside of the windows. My hands were so numb I couldn't feel them anymore. "Who even knows about what we did?" Mia asked. "We were careful." "Someone knows," Walker said. "Someone always knows." Through the green emergency light, we could see shadows moving past different windows, like there was more than one person out there, or like one person moving impossibly fast. The intercom crackled. 30 minutes. Say it. All of it. What you did to make her drive off that cliff. That's when Oliver stood up and walked toward the intercom. "Fine. We made a fake Instagram account, posted photos of her, spread rumors that she was sleeping with teachers. I took a video of her crying in the bathroom and sent it to everyone. We turned the whole school against her because we were bored. We made her life hell," Scarlett added, crying, "for months. She took her own life because of us," Oliver continued. "Is that what you wanted to hear?" The silence that followed was worse than the shooting. I knew we weren't saying everything, that Oliver was leaving out the worst part, and my stomach churned knowing I should speak up but being too much of a coward. Then the intercom came on one last time, and the voice wasn't distorted anymore. It was clear, familiar, and absolutely impossible. "Wrong again," Rachel's voice said. "I didn't take my own life. I just let you all think I did." We all stared at each other in horror. Rachel was alive. Rachel had been alive this whole year while we carried the guilt of killing her. "But that's not even the worst thing you did to me," she continued. "Not even close." Another shot rang out, and Oliver screamed. He fell to the floor, clutching his shoulder, blood spreading across his shirt. Not a kill shot, but enough to make everyone scream and scramble away from the windows. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart pounding out of my chest. Now. Rachel's voice said, calm as ever while Oliver writhed on the floor. "Which one of you drugged me at that party?" The silence after Rachel's question stretched so long, I thought maybe time had stopped working. Oliver kept making these awful wet sounds on the floor, holding his shoulder while blood seeped through his fingers and pooled on the wood beneath him. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard, I was sure everyone could hear it over the howling wind outside. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. We all just stood there in that sick green emergency light, frozen like someone had hit pause on our lives. The thing was, we all knew this was the real secret, the one that made all the other stuff look like nothing. The cyberbullying, the fake accounts, the video, all of that was cruel and terrible, but drugging someone at a party was something else entirely. That was criminal. That was the kind of thing that could destroy someone's whole life, and whoever did it knew they might not survive this night if they admitted it. The wind screamed through the broken windows and snow kept pouring in, but none of us paid attention to the cold anymore. Walker finally broke the silence by dropping to his knees next to Oliver and pressing his jacket against the wound. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely keep pressure on it, and I watched his fingers slip in Oliver's blood twice before he got a good grip. Oliver groaned and tried to push Walker away, but he was too weak to do much more than twitch. Mia was crying in the corner, not the quiet kind of crying, but full-on hysterical sobs that made her whole body shake. Scarlett stood completely still, staring at the intercom mounted on the wall, like she expected it to explode any second. I realized we were all thinking the same thing, running through our memories of that party, trying to remember who had been near Rachel's drinks, who had offered her something, who had acted weird. My stomach twisted because I remembered seeing things that night, little details I'd ignored or forgotten, and now they were coming back sharp and clear. Henry suddenly stood up and walked toward the kitchen without saying anything. His footsteps sounded too loud in the tense silence. Then he cleared his throat and said he needed water, but his voice came out all wrong and tight, like someone was squeezing his throat. I watched Elena's face change as she tracked Henry's movement across the room. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened a little, and I could see her putting pieces together in her head. She looked at me with this question in her eyes that made my stomach drop straight to my feet. I knew what she was asking without words. I knew because I'd been asking myself the same thing since Rachel's question came through the intercom. Henry had been so insistent about that party, so eager to make sure Rachel came, so focused on her having a good time. At the time, I thought he just liked her, but now those memories took on a darker shade. The intercom crackled to life, and Rachel's voice came through calm and cold as ice. She said we had 20 minutes left to decide what we were going to do. 20 minutes before Oliver needed a hospital or he might not make it. Her voice was steady, almost bored, like she was reading a grocery list instead of threatening someone's life. She added that the person who drugged her knew exactly what they did, knew how it felt to watch her stumble and slur her words, and not understand what was happening to her own body. If they didn't confess, she'd make sure Oliver bled out while we all watched. She'd make us sit here in the freezing lodge and watch him die slowly, and then maybe she'd start shooting the rest of us one by one until someone finally told the truth. The intercom clicked off, and the silence that followed felt heavier than before, pressing down on all of us like a physical weight. Walker exploded off the floor and started yelling at the intercom about how this was completely insane. He screamed that we were just stupid kids who made mistakes, that we didn't know what we were doing, that holding us hostage and shooting people wasn't going to fix anything. His voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear how scared he was underneath the anger. Rachel's laugh came through the speakers, bitter and sharp enough to cut. She said drugging someone wasn't a mistake, it was a crime, and she wasn't a kid when it happened to her, so why should we get to use that excuse? Her voice got harder as she told us she had every text message we'd ever sent about her, every social media post, every photo, every video. She'd been collecting evidence for a year while we all thought she was dead. She had proof of everything we did, and if we didn't give her what she wanted tonight, she'd make sure every bit of that evidence went to the police and the school and our parents and anyone else who would listen. I forced myself to move toward Oliver because nobody else was doing anything useful. My legs felt like they were made of concrete, but I made them work anyway. Walker backed away to give me room, and up close I could see the bullet had gone through the meaty part of Oliver's shoulder, in the front and out the back. There was so much blood, way more than I expected, and it kept coming even with Walker's jacket pressed against it. Oliver wasn't dying right this second, but he was losing blood fast and his face had gone gray in the green emergency light. When he looked up at me, his eyes were filled with terror and pain that made my chest hurt. I thought about confessing everything right then, about telling Rachel what I'd seen at the party, just to end this nightmare and get Oliver help. But the words stuck in my throat because I was too much of a coward to face what would come after. Henry came back from the kitchen holding a glass of water with both hands to keep it from spilling. His hands wouldn't stop shaking and water slopped over the rim onto the floor. He wouldn't look at anyone, just stared down at the glass like it was the most interesting thing in the world. Scarlett took a step toward him and asked if he was okay, her voice soft and careful like she was talking to a scared animal. The way Henry flinched at her question made everyone notice him at once. Elena actually gasped and backed away from him like he'd suddenly become dangerous. The glass slipped from Henry's hands and shattered on the floor, water and broken glass spreading across the wood. Henry stared at the mess and started apologizing over and over, but nobody was listening to his words. We were all watching his face, watching the guilt written there so clearly it might as well have been spelled out in neon lights. Mia started talking really fast about how we needed to just tell Rachel everything we knew, and maybe she'd let us go. Her words tumbled over each other as she brought up every detail of the cyberbullying campaign. She talked about the fake Instagram account we made, the edited photos we posted to make Rachel look bad, the rumors we spread about her sleeping with teachers. She mentioned the group chat where we planned what to say about Rachel each day, how we coordinated our attacks to maximize damage. She offered up every bit of information like it was currency that could buy our freedom, like confessing to the smaller crimes would somehow make the bigger one disappear. But Rachel stayed silent on the intercom. No response, no acknowledgement, nothing. The silence from the speakers was somehow worse than her threats had been. The temperature in the lodge had dropped, so low I could see everyone's breath forming clouds in the air. My fingers had gone completely numb, and I couldn't feel my toes anymore inside my boots. Oliver was shivering badly, his whole body shaking in a way that looked wrong. Walker said that meant he was going into shock, that his body was shutting down from blood loss and cold. We scrambled to find coats and blankets, wrapping Oliver in everything we could grab. But the wind howling through the broken windows kept stealing any warmth we tried to create. Snow had piled up on the floor near the shattered glass, and ice was forming on the inside of the intact windows. I knew we were running out of time in multiple ways. Oliver might not survive much longer without real medical help. The cold might kill us all before Rachel had to fire another shot, and that 20-minute deadline was ticking down with every second we wasted. Elena turned to face Henry directly and asked him point blank if he drugged Rachel at the party. Her voice was shaking but determined, like she'd made up her mind to push through her fear and get the truth. Henry's face went completely white, all the blood draining out of it so fast I thought he might pass out. He started stammering about how that was crazy. Why would she even think that? Where was she getting these ideas? But his denial sounded hollow and panicked instead of offended. A truly innocent person would have been angry at the accusation, would have demanded to know why anyone would think such a terrible thing. Henry just sounded scared and desperate, and that told us everything we needed to know. My brain started replaying that party in sharp detail, like someone hit rewind on a video I'd tried to forget. Henry had been all over Rachel that night, following her around with drinks, always pushing a red cup into her hands. I'd thought he was just being friendly, maybe trying to get her to loosen up since she'd been so quiet after everything we'd done to her. But now I could see his face in my memory, how focused he'd looked, how he kept checking to make sure she drank from the cup he'd opened himself. She'd said something felt wrong maybe 20 minutes after taking that drink from him. Her words had gotten slurred and her eyes looked confused, like she couldn't quite focus on anything. I'd watched her stumble toward the bathroom and I'd done nothing, just stood there like the coward I was. The memory made me want to throw up right there on the lodge floor because I'd seen it happen and I'd known something was off but I hadn't said a word. Walker's voice cut through my thoughts, sharp and defensive. He told Elena she needed to back off because we were all stressed out and turning on each other was exactly what Rachel wanted us to do. But Scarlett wasn't having it anymore. She stepped forward and pointed out that Henry had been the one to suggest throwing that party in the first place, that he'd been weirdly insistent about Rachel coming, even though we'd spent months making her life horrible. Elena joined in, her voice shaking but determined, reminding everyone that Henry had kept pushing drinks on Rachel even after she'd said she felt weird and wanted to go home. Mia was nodding along now, backing away from Henry like she'd just realized she'd been standing next to a monster this whole time. I watched Henry's face change as everyone stared at him, watched the color drain out until he looked gray in the green emergency lighting. His mouth opened and closed a few times like he was trying to find words that would make this okay, but nothing came out except this broken, sobbing sound. Tears started running down his face and his whole body shook, and he kept saying he didn't mean for anything bad to happen. The words tumbled out of him fast and desperate, how he just wanted her to relax and have fun, how he'd put something in her drink to loosen her up. He swore he didn't know she'd react so badly, that he didn't think we'd all turn it into ammunition to use against her. He kept saying it like that made it better, like his intentions somehow erased what he'd actually done to her. The confession just hung there in the freezing air between us, while we all processed what he'd admitted. Even Walker looked sick now, his face twisted up in disgust as he stared at Henry like he'd never seen him before. Elena started screaming, her voice high and hysterical, yelling about how drugging someone is rape behavior, even if you don't physically assault them. She was crying and screaming at the same time, asking Henry if he understood what he'd done, if he had any idea what that drug had done to Rachel's to consent or protect herself. Mia backed away from Henry fast, pressing herself against the wall like he might contaminate her if she got too close. I could feel our entire friend group falling apart in real time, all the bonds we'd built over years just snapping like frozen branches under too much weight. The intercom crackled and Rachel's voice came through, quiet but somehow more frightening than when she'd been yelling. She thanked Henry for finally telling the truth, her voice dripping with bitter satisfaction. Then she started describing in detail what had happened after he drugged her, how she'd felt disconnected from her own body like she was watching herself from far away. She talked about how she couldn't think straight or make decisions, how everything felt fuzzy and wrong, but she couldn't articulate what was happening to her. Her voice got harder when she described how Oliver had filmed her in that vulnerable state, how everyone had laughed at her stumbling and slurring, how they'd used that video to destroy what was left of her reputation. She said we'd taken her autonomy, her dignity, her sense of safety in her own body, and we'd done it for entertainment. Henry was full-on sobbing now, his face buried in his hands, begging Rachel through the intercom to understand he was just a stupid kid who made a terrible mistake. His voice was muffled and broken, pleading for her to see that he hadn't meant to hurt her like that. Rachel's response cut through his begging like a knife, her voice ice-cold and precise. She asked him if he'd thought she was just a stupid kid who deserved to be drugged and humiliated and driven to the edge of suicide. She asked if his being young and stupid somehow made her suffering less real, if his regret now erased the years she'd spent recovering from what he'd done. The silence that followed was worse than any response could have been, just the sound of Henry sobbing and the wind howling through the broken windows. Oliver groaned from his position on the floor, his face pale and sweaty despite the cold. He said we needed to get him to a hospital right now or he was going to die, his voice weak and scared. Walker agreed immediately, saying we had to do something because Oliver was losing too much blood and going into shock. Rachel's voice cut through our panic, calm and controlled. She said she'd tell us how to get out alive, how to get Oliver the medical help he needed, but only after Henry faced real consequences, instead of just offering apologies and tears. I found my voice for the first time in what felt like hours, though it came out shaky and small. I asked Rachel what she wanted from us. What would make this end? Her answer was simple and terrifying. She said she wanted Henry to come outside and face her directly, to admit what he'd done to her face instead of hiding behind walls and friends. She promised that if he did that, she'd let the rest of us leave, tell us where to find help for Oliver. Henry's response was immediate and panicked, saying she'd kill him if he went outside. Walker surprisingly backed him up, saying it was obviously a trap, and we couldn't trust Rachel to keep her word. But Scarlett cut in, her voice sharp with logic. She pointed out that we were all dying in here anyway between the cold and Oliver's bleeding, and maybe Rachel was telling the truth about letting us go if Henry cooperated. Elena had moved to one of the boarded windows while we were arguing, pressing her eye against a crack in the wood. She said she could see someone moving out there in the snow, a figure standing near the tree line. The rifle was lowered now, not aimed at the lodge anymore, and the figure was just standing there waiting. Elena's voice was thoughtful when she said maybe Rachel really did just want to talk to Henry face to face, that maybe this wasn't about murder after all. I heard myself speaking before I'd even decided to say anything, my voice cutting through the scared silence to tell everyone I thought we should trust Rachel on this. The words felt wrong coming out of my mouth, but also somehow right, and I watched 5 pairs of eyes turn to stare at me like I'd completely lost my mind. My hands were shaking badly, and I shoved them in my pockets while I explained that Rachel had spent a whole year planning this, that she'd had multiple chances to kill all of us already, but she'd only shot Oliver as a warning in his shoulder instead of somewhere fatal. I said that had to mean something, that maybe she wanted justice or answers or just to face Henry directly instead of committing murder. And my voice got stronger as I kept talking, even though part of me couldn't believe I was defending the person who'd been shooting at us. Walker immediately argued back that I was being completely naive and Rachel was obviously unstable after everything we did to her. But I cut him off and pointed out that we were the ones who destroyed her life on purpose, who spread lies and filmed her crying and made fake accounts to ruin her reputation because we were bored. I said maybe Rachel deserved to face Henry and tell him everything she needed to say. And maybe we deserved to witness it instead of pretending we hadn't all participated in destroying her, and the words came out harsh and angry because I was finally admitting out loud what we'd really done. Walker's face went red and he started to yell something back at me, but Mia's voice interrupted him, quiet and shaking, saying she agreed with me. Everyone turned to look at her in shock while she wrapped her arms around herself and admitted she'd been carrying guilt about Rachel for an entire year, that it had been eating her alive every single day, and she couldn't keep pretending it didn't happen anymore. Scarlett started crying and said she had the same thing, that she kept having nightmares about Rachel's face in that video Oliver took, seeing her confused and scared expression over and over in her dreams. Elena's voice was barely a whisper when she admitted she'd been going to therapy for months trying to process what we did. But she couldn't tell her therapist the full truth about drugging Rachel and destroying her life, so the therapy wasn't even helping because she was lying about the worst parts. Henry had backed himself into the corner of the room while we were talking, literally pressing against the wall like he wanted to disappear through it. And now 5 of his former friends were staring at him with faces showing disgust and determination instead of the loyalty he was used to. He kept saying he couldn't go out there, that Rachel would kill him the second he stepped outside, his voice getting higher and more panicked with each word. Walker looked at Henry for a long moment, and I saw something change in his expression, some final piece of loyalty breaking apart. Walker told Henry that maybe he deserved whatever Rachel had planned after what he did, and the words hung in the freezing air while Henry's face crumbled. The intercom crackled to life, and Rachel's voice came through calm and controlled, giving us exactly 10 minutes to make our decision. She added that Oliver's shoulder was still bleeding pretty badly, and shock could kill someone just as easily as a bullet could, her tone almost clinical, like she was explaining a medical fact. Rachel said if Henry came outside to face her, she'd tell us where she'd parked a snowmobile that could get Oliver to the main road, and a hospital. But if Henry refused, we'd all freeze to death together in the lodge while she watched from outside where it was warmer. I looked over at Oliver, who was barely conscious now, his face so pale it looked gray in the green emergency lighting, and I knew we were running out of time in multiple ways at once. I started looking around the lodge more carefully, trying to understand how Rachel had been watching and listening to us this whole time, and that's when I noticed something weird about the smoke detector on the ceiling. I dragged a chair over and climbed up to examine it closer, and my stomach dropped when I found a tiny camera lens hidden in the plastic casing, so small I almost missed it even when I was looking right at it. I called the others over and showed them what I'd found, and the realization hit all of us at the same time that Rachel had cameras everywhere, that she'd been watching our reactions and listening to our conversations during this entire nightmare. She'd seen every moment of our fear and panic and guilt, had watched us confess and argue and turn on each other, and suddenly the scope of her planning became terrifyingly clear. Scarlett immediately started searching the kitchen and found another camera tucked into the corner of a cabinet, positioned to see the whole room. Elena checked the bathroom and discovered one hidden in the air vent, and we all stood there staring at each other as we understood that Rachel hadn't just set up this confrontation tonight on impulse. She'd been studying us for who knows how long, learning our patterns and schedules, watching us live our normal lives while we thought she was dead and buried, and she'd waited for the perfect moment to strike when we'd all be together and isolated. The realization was both completely terrifying and somehow impressive in a sick way, because it took serious commitment and planning to pull off something this elaborate. Walker went back to the smoke detector camera and carefully removed it from the ceiling, examining the equipment with the focused attention he usually saved for his engineering projects. He recognized it immediately as professional surveillance gear, the kind that cost thousands of dollars and required technical knowledge to install and operate correctly. Walker said Rachel must have spent months saving up money to buy all this equipment, and she'd obviously learned serious technical skills to set it up without anyone noticing, which meant her revenge wasn't just impulsive rage or a breakdown. He said this was calculated justice, planned and executed with precision, and somehow that distinction mattered in a way I couldn't quite explain. This wasn't a girl who'd snapped and gone crazy with grief. This was someone who'd spent an entire year preparing to hold us accountable for what we did, and there was something almost respectable about that level of determination, even though I was terrified. Henry was hyperventilating in his corner, taking rapid, shallow breaths that made his whole body shake, and despite everything he'd done, I felt a flicker of sympathy for him watching him fall apart like that. But then I remembered Rachel's face in that video Oliver had taken and spread around. How confused and scared she'd looked. How violated she must have felt seeing herself in that state broadcast to everyone at the school. I thought about how alone she must have been after we destroyed her reputation and turned the whole school against her. How scared she must have been driving home that night after Henry drugged her. And my sympathy for Henry disappeared completely because he'd created this entire situation through his own predatory behavior, and now he was finally facing real consequences. Elena had been searching near the cameras and suddenly called out that she'd found something else, holding up a small notebook that had been tucked behind one of the camera mounts. She opened it, and her eyes went wide as she started reading. And when she showed us, we saw Rachel had written detailed notes about each of us, documenting our schedules and relationships and secrets, like she was conducting surveillance on criminals. Rachel had tracked our lives for the past year while we all thought she was dead, writing down where we went, and who we saw, and what we did, and reading her observations about my own behavior made me feel completely exposed and ashamed. She'd written about the time I'd laughed at a joke someone made about her death, about how I'd never once visited her supposed grave or acknowledged what we'd done to her, about how I'd just moved on with my life like destroying someone was no big deal. Every page had more details about our lives, proof that Rachel had been watching us constantly while we lived in ignorance, and the notebook made it impossible to deny how much damage we'd caused or pretend we didn't know exactly what we'd done to her. I flipped through the notebook with shaking hands and found pages of typed conversations, word-for-word transcripts of things we'd said about Rachel after her supposed death. My stomach dropped reading the first entry dated 3 weeks after the accident, where Walker joked that at least we didn't have to worry about her snitching anymore. Elena had laughed and said something about dodging a bullet, and I'd added that maybe it was for the best since she was probably headed for a breakdown anyway. Seeing our exact words preserved like evidence in a criminal case made my skin crawl because we'd been so casual about it. Like her death was just a minor inconvenience we'd already moved past. There were dozens of these conversations recorded over months, each one showing how quickly we'd absolved ourselves and returned to normal life. We'd made jokes, minimized what we'd done, convinced ourselves the cyberbullying wasn't that bad, and she'd been too sensitive anyway. Reading it now with Rachel alive and holding us accountable made me understand her rage in a way I hadn't before, because we'd treated her destruction like entertainment and her death like relief. Mia grabbed the notebook from my hands and started reading aloud, her voice breaking as she got to a section Rachel had written in her own handwriting. Rachel described sitting in a coffee shop across from our high school, watching Oliver walk out with his acceptance letter to Stanford, the scholarship that would pay for everything, and feeling such intense anger she'd had to leave before she did something violent. She wrote about how Oliver got to celebrate his future while she was living under a fake name in a different state, how he got to move forward with his life while she had to rebuild everything from nothing. The entry detailed how Rachel had spent 6 months working minimum wage jobs to save money for her revenge plan, how she'd taught herself surveillance techniques, and studied each of our schedules, how she'd tracked our social media posts about parties and accomplishments while she lived in hiding. Mia's voice got quieter as she read Rachel's observation that we'd all just continued like her destruction was a minor thing we'd already forgotten, that none of us had lost sleep or opportunities or futures over what we'd done to her. The words hit different hearing them out loud, because they made it impossible to pretend we hadn't known exactly how much damage we'd caused. I took the notebook back and found the section with my name at the top, and my hands started shaking worse as I read what Rachel had written about me specifically. She'd documented every time she'd seen me over the past year, noting that I never once visited her grave or mentioned her name in public. She wrote that I'd stood by and watched everything happen to her, that my silence had given permission for everyone else's cruelty, that passive participation was still participation in her destruction. There was a whole paragraph about how she'd watched me laugh at a joke someone made about her death at a party last month, how I'd smiled and moved on with the conversation like she'd never existed. Rachel wrote that she'd reserved special contempt for people like me who pretended to be good while enabling evil, who told themselves they weren't responsible because they didn't actively participate. Reading her analysis of my character made me want to throw up because she was right about everything, and I'd spent a year lying to myself about my role in what happened to her. She'd seen through all my excuses and self-justification, and having it written out in black and white made it impossible to hide from what I'd really been. The intercom crackled to life, and Rachel's voice cut through the freezing air, calm and final. She said we had 5 minutes left to make a decision, and I could hear in her tone that she was done waiting for us to do the right thing. I looked over at Oliver, who was barely conscious anymore, his face gray and his lips turning blue from blood loss and cold. Walker was crying openly while pressing his jacket against Oliver's shoulder, begging him to stay awake, but Oliver's eyes kept rolling back in his head. The pool of blood on the floor had spread wider, and I knew we were running out of time in multiple ways, because even if Rachel let us go now, Oliver might not survive the trip to a hospital. Scarlett was shaking so hard her teeth chattered, and Elena had wrapped herself in blankets but still looked frozen through. The temperature in the lodge had dropped so low that ice was forming on the inside walls, and the wind howling through the broken windows sounded like screaming. I stood up and walked directly to Henry, who was still huddled in the corner trying to make himself invisible. I looked him in the eyes and told him he had to go outside and face what he'd done to Rachel, that he had to stop hiding and start taking responsibility. Henry stared at me with complete betrayal on his face, like I'd just stabbed him in the back, and he asked how I could do this to him after everything we'd been through together. I didn't back down even though my voice was shaking, and I said someone needed to stop protecting him and start protecting everyone else, including Rachel, who never got protection from any of us when she needed it. Henry tried to argue that going outside was suicide, and I was basically killing him. But I pointed at Oliver bleeding on the floor and said Henry had already created one victim tonight, and I wasn't going to let him create more. The look on Henry's face shifted from betrayal to pure fear, and he started backing further into the corner like a trapped animal. Scarlett stood up and moved to stand beside me, physically blocking Henry's escape route from the corner. Elena joined us a second later, and then Mia got up too, all three of them forming a wall between Henry and the rest of the room. Walker looked torn for a moment, glancing between Henry and Oliver, but then he finally nodded and said, Henry needed to do the right thing for once in his life. Henry's eyes went wide as he realized all 5 of his friends were united against him, that he was completely alone in his refusal to face consequences. He started crying harder and asking why we were turning on him, reminding us we'd all been involved in what happened to Rachel. But Scarlett said what Henry did was different, that drugging someone was a crime that could have ended in rape or death, and the rest of us hadn't crossed that line even if we'd done terrible things too. Henry switched tactics and started bargaining desperately, saying he'd confess everything to the police if we just didn't make him go outside. He promised he'd accept whatever legal consequences came, that he'd plead guilty and go to jail if that's what it took, as long as we kept him safe from Rachel. His voice was high and panicked, and he kept saying Rachel would kill him the second he stepped outside, that this was just revenge disguised as justice. But Rachel's voice came through the intercom, cutting him off, saying she didn't trust the legal system that had failed her before when she'd tried to report the cyberbullying. She said she needed to look Henry in the eyes when he admitted what he'd done, that she needed all of us to witness his confession directly, instead of letting lawyers and plea deals water it down. Rachel's voice was steady and cold, and she added that if Henry was really sorry, he'd be willing to face her instead of hiding behind his friends and legal protection. I made the decision without asking anyone else and walked to the front door, my hands shaking as I reached for the handle. The second I pulled it open, a blast of Arctic air and snow rushed in so hard it nearly knocked me backward. The wind was screaming and visibility was almost zero through the blizzard, but I could barely make out Rachel's dark shape standing about 20 feet away from the lodge. She had the rifle lowered at her side, not pointed at anything, just waiting there completely still. Something about her stillness was more frightening than all the shooting had been, because it showed how calm and in control she was while we'd been panicking inside. Through the swirling snow, I could see she was wearing heavy winter gear, and I wondered how long she'd been standing out there in negative temperatures just waiting for us to make the right choice. The cold was so intense it burned my exposed skin immediately, and I had to squint against the wind and ice pellets hitting my face. Henry was pushed forward by the group, not roughly but with firm hands on his shoulders guiding him toward the open door. He stumbled and nearly fell, crying and begging us not to make him do this. I felt a moment of doubt watching him break down so completely, wondering if we were doing the right thing by forcing him outside. But then I remembered Rachel's face in that video Oliver had taken and spread around. How confused and violated she'd looked. How alone she must have been after we destroyed her reputation. I thought about how she'd spent an entire year in hiding, while Henry got to celebrate his 18th birthday, like nothing had happened. How he'd never once tried to make things right, or even acknowledge what he'd done to her. My doubt disappeared completely, because Henry had created this whole situation through his own predatory behavior, and now he was finally facing real consequences, instead of getting away with it like he'd gotten away with everything else. Rachel's voice came through the intercom one last time, and I could hear her clearly despite the wind. She told Henry to walk toward her slowly with his hands where she could see them, that if he tried to run or attack her, she'd shoot him without hesitation. But she said if he came peacefully and told the truth about everything he'd done, she'd keep her promise about the snowmobile and getting Oliver to a hospital. Her voice was steady and businesslike, like she was giving instructions for a normal task instead of orchestrating a confrontation in the middle of a deadly blizzard. She added that she needed us all to hear Henry's confession, that we needed to witness him taking responsibility, and then she'd let the rest of us go free. The intercom clicked off, and Henry stood in the doorway shaking and crying, the snow already covering his hair and shoulders, while Rachel waited motionless in the storm. Henry took his first step into the blizzard, and the wind hit him so hard he stumbled sideways. We crowded in the doorway watching him push forward through snow that came up past his knees. Each step looked like it took everything he had, and twice the wind nearly knocked him flat on his face. The cold was brutal even from inside where we stood, and I couldn't stop thinking about Rachel standing out there for who knows how long just waiting for this exact moment. Henry kept his hands up where she could see them, and his whole body was shaking from cold and fear. The snow covered him so fast he looked like a ghost moving through the storm. When he got about 15 feet from Rachel, she raised the rifle slightly but didn't point it right at him. Her voice carried on the wind but barely, and we had to strain to hear her asking him to say it. Henry's response got lost completely in the howling storm. Rachel yelled louder that we all needed to hear him admit what he did. She said his friends needed to witness his confession because they'd spent a year protecting him and lying for him. Henry stopped moving and just stood there in the snow, and I could see his shoulders shaking with sobs even from the doorway. Rachel screamed at him to say it loud enough for everyone to hear. Henry's voice finally carried back to us, broken and sobbing. He admitted he drugged Rachel's drink at the party. He said he put Rohypnol in her vodka cranberry because he wanted her to be more fun and less uptight. Hearing him say it out loud with such casual cruelty like he was talking about changing someone's playlist made Elena gasp next to me. Mia started crying again, and even Walker looked sick. The words hung in the freezing air, and I felt my stomach turn because I'd known something was wrong that night, but I'd stayed quiet. Rachel asked Henry if he understood that what he did was rape by incapacitation, even though he didn't physically assault her himself. Her voice was steady and cold, and she said he rendered her unable to consent or protect herself. She said his friends then filmed her and mocked her, and destroyed her reputation while she was still trying to understand what happened to her body and mind. The wind died down just enough for us to hear Henry's response. He said yes, he understood now, and he was sorry. Rachel's laugh was bitter and carried clearly through the storm. She asked if Sorry fixed the year she spent in hiding. She asked if Sorry paid her therapy bills or stopped her nightmares or gave her back the ability to trust anyone. She asked if Sorry rebuilt the future plans we completely destroyed when we turned her into a joke for the entire school. Henry had no answer and just stood there crying in the snow. I watched Rachel lower the rifle completely and pull out her phone. Suddenly lights appeared through the trees, getting brighter as they got closer. A snowmobile came roaring up through the storm and stopped right next to Rachel. A figure in heavy winter gear climbed off but kept the engine running. We all realized at the same moment that Rachel had helped this entire time. Someone believed her story enough to assist in this whole revenge plan. The accomplice stood next to Rachel like a bodyguard, and I wondered who it was and how much they knew about what we did. Rachel told Henry to get on the snowmobile with her accomplice. She said they would take him to the main road where police were already waiting. She said she called them hours ago and told them everything. She said Henry would be arrested for drugging her, and we'd all be questioned about the cyberbullying campaign. She said there would finally be real consequences instead of just guilt and fear. The accomplice helped Henry onto the snowmobile, and he didn't fight or try to run. He just climbed on like he was in shock, and maybe he was. Rachel turned to face the lodge where we were all watching from the doorway. She yelled that a second snowmobile was hidden behind the shed with keys in the ignition. She said we needed to get Oliver to the hospital immediately before he bled out. Then she climbed on behind Henry, and the snowmobile took off into the blizzard heading toward the road. We watched until the lights disappeared completely into the white storm. For a few seconds, nobody moved because we were all processing what just happened. Then Walker snapped into action and grabbed my arm. We ran around to the shed, fighting through snow that was waist deep in some places. The shed door was frozen shut, and it took both of us pulling to get it open. Inside, we found the snowmobile exactly where Rachel said it would be. Keys dangled from the ignition, and there were extra helmets and gloves piled on the seat. We ran back to the lodge where Elena and Scarlett were already trying to get Oliver ready to move. He was barely conscious and his face was gray. Blood had soaked through all the coats we'd wrapped around his shoulder. Mia was grabbing whatever warm clothes she could find and stuffing them in a bag. Walker said he'd drive while I held Oliver steady. Scarlett insisted on coming too in case we needed extra hands. We got Oliver outside and onto the snowmobile, which was harder than it sounds because he kept passing out. I climbed on behind Walker, and we managed to prop Oliver between us. Scarlett squeezed on behind me and wrapped her arms around all of us to help hold Oliver in place. Walker started the engine and we took off into the blizzard. The ride to the main road was the most scared I'd ever been in my life. Visibility was almost zero, and several times I thought we were going to crash into a tree. The cold was so intense it burned any exposed skin, and my face felt like it was stabbed with needles. Oliver kept drifting in and out, and every time he went limp, I was terrified he'd died. I held him as tight as I could and prayed we'd make it in time. Scarlett was crying behind me, but I couldn't hear her over the wind and engine. I kept thinking about how we were all paying for our cruelty now in different ways. Oliver might die from a bullet wound. Henry was going to jail. The rest of us would have to live with what we did and face whatever legal consequences came next. Rachel had spent a year planning this revenge, and she'd pulled it off perfectly. We'd destroyed her life as entertainment, and now she was making sure we understood exactly what that felt like. The road appeared through the snow like a miracle. Red and blue lights cut through the white, and I counted 4 police cars and an ambulance parked in a line. Walker killed the engine and paramedics ran toward us before we even got off the snowmobile. They pulled Oliver away from me and loaded him onto a stretcher, and I watched them cut his blood-soaked jacket away while one of them pressed an oxygen mask to his face. Police officers surrounded us immediately and started separating us into different patrol cars. I saw Henry already sitting in the back of one with his hands cuffed behind him, and his face looked completely broken. An officer guided me toward another car while Scarlett was led to a third one. Everyone was being kept apart, and I realized they were treating this like a crime scene, which I guess it was. My legs barely worked after the freezing ride, and the officer had to help me walk. I climbed into the back seat and the door closed, and suddenly I was alone with just the sound of the heater blowing. A detective opened the door a few minutes later and slid in next to me. She had dark hair pulled back and tired eyes, and she told me her name, but I immediately forgot it. She asked me to explain everything that happened tonight, and I started talking. I told her about the intercom threats, the shooting, Oliver getting hit, Rachel's voice revealing she was alive. I admitted to the cyberbullying campaign we ran against Rachel, to the fake accounts and the rumors and the video Oliver took. I told her about seeing Henry drug Rachel's drink at the party last year and not saying anything, not stopping him, just watching it happen. With each confession, my chest felt lighter and heavier at the same time, like I was releasing pressure but taking on weight. The detective wrote everything down and recorded it on her phone, and she never looked shocked or disgusted, just kept nodding and asking follow-up questions. When I finished, she was quiet for a long minute. Then she told me that Rachel came to them months ago with evidence of what we did. She brought screenshots, videos, witness statements, everything documented carefully. But the cyberbullying happened when we were minors, so prosecution was complicated, and the district attorney wasn't sure they could make charges stick. The detective said Rachel's revenge plan tonight was actually approved by the police as a way to get Henry's confession on record. They knew she was planning something at the ski lodge, and they worked with her to make sure it stayed controlled. I stared at the detective in shock, trying to process that the entire night was a sanctioned operation. The detective saw my expression and explained that Rachel's methods were unusual, but they were effective. She said Henry's recorded confession combined with all the evidence Rachel collected over the past year means he'll face serious charges. The detective told me that Rachel is studying criminal justice now at a different college under her new identity. She changed her name, moved to a new state, started completely over. She wants to help other victims get justice when the system fails them, and apparently she's really good at it. The detective said Rachel spent months learning surveillance techniques and studying law enforcement procedures. She planned every detail of tonight to force the truth out while staying within legal boundaries. I asked if Rachel was okay, and the detective said she's doing better than any of us probably deserve. Over the next few days, the full story came out in interviews and legal proceedings. Henry was charged with felony drug-facilitated sexual assault, and the rest of us faced various charges related to harassment and cyberbullying. The media picked up the story fast, and suddenly everyone knew what we did to Rachel and how she got revenge. News vans showed up at my parents' house. Reporters called my phone constantly. I saw our school photos on television with headlines about cyberbullying and assault. My parents hired a lawyer who told me to stop talking to anyone except the police and prosecutors. I gave 3 more formal statements over those days, each time going through every detail of what we did to Rachel. Oliver survived his shoulder injury and made a full physical recovery within a few weeks. But he was expelled from college and lost his scholarship. He gave an interview to a local news station where he apologized to Rachel and admitted he was a bully who enjoyed hurting someone vulnerable. I watched him cry on camera and talk about his regrets, and it didn't make me feel better because it didn't undo anything. His apology felt hollow, even though I think he meant it. Mia, Scarlett, Elena, and I all accepted plea deals that included probation, community service, and mandatory counseling. We had to write formal apologies to Rachel and complete programs about cyberbullying and consent. The judge made it clear we were getting off easy because we cooperated and showed genuine remorse. My deal included 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and weekly therapy sessions. I had to stay in state and report to a probation officer monthly. Henry refused to take a plea deal, so his case went to trial. Rachel testified against him in court, and I attended every day to support her. Watching her calmly describe what he did to her and how it affected her life was one of the most powerful things I've ever witnessed. She didn't cry or yell. She just told the truth in a steady voice while the jury listened. She described feeling disconnected from her body after he drugged her. She talked about the video Oliver took and how it spread through school. She explained how the cyberbullying campaign destroyed her relationships and her reputation. I saw jury members crying as she spoke. The jury convicted Henry on all counts after deliberating for less than 4 hours. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in prison, followed by lifetime registration as a sex offender. His parents tried to hug him before the officers took him away, and he was sobbing and saying he was sorry. But it was too late for sorry to matter because the consequences were finally real and permanent. I watched him disappear through the courtroom doors in handcuffs. 3 months after everything, I got permission through my lawyer to write Rachel a letter. I spent weeks working on it with my therapist. I wrote draft after draft, trying to find the right words. I didn't ask for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I told her I understand now what we did to her. I explained that I'm spending the rest of my life trying to be better than the person who hurt her. I sent the letter and didn't expect a response. 2 weeks later, an envelope arrived with Rachel's return address, and my hands shook so badly I almost couldn't open it. Her handwriting was neat and careful on lined paper, and I sat on my apartment floor reading her words over and over. She wrote that she doesn't forgive us and probably never will, but she appreciates that we're facing real consequences and trying to change instead of making excuses. She said she hopes we use what happened to help other people avoid becoming bullies or standing by while bullying happens, and that maybe some good can come from all the pain if we actually commit to being better. Her words hit harder than anything the judge said because they were honest and real, and I kept the letter in my desk drawer where I could see it every day. The following month, I started volunteering with an organization that sends speakers to high schools to talk about bullying and its effects. My first talk was at a school an hour away, and I stood in front of 30 sophomores feeling like I might throw up. I told them everything about what we did to Rachel, how we created fake accounts and spread rumors and filmed her crying, and how one of us drugged her at a party. I explained that I watched it all happen and did nothing because I was scared of losing my friends, and my cowardice helped destroy someone's life. Some students looked bored or checked their phones, but others really listened, and one girl came up afterward and told me her friend group was doing similar things to someone. She said hearing my story made her realize she needed to stop it before it went too far, and I gave her resources for how to help her friend and report the bullying. Those talks became a regular thing, twice a month at different schools, and every single one was difficult and embarrassing but necessary. I forced myself to be completely honest about being a coward who enabled cruelty, and I saw some students taking notes and asking questions about how to intervene when they see bullying happening. Walker and I started meeting monthly at a diner halfway between our colleges, both of us trying to rebuild our lives while carrying the weight of what we did. Our first meeting was awkward and quiet, neither of us sure what to say, but eventually we started talking honestly about our guilt and our efforts to make things right. He told me about his community service working with at-risk youth, and I told him about my speaking engagements, and we compared notes on our therapy sessions. Having someone who understood what we'd done, and was also trying to change, helped in a way nothing else could, even though we both knew nothing would ever erase our past or make us truly clean. We checked in on each other's progress, made sure neither of us was slipping back into old patterns, and sometimes we just sat together in shared understanding of how badly we'd messed up. Scarlett sent me updates about her work at college, and I learned she'd become a leader in consent education programs. She helped create workshops about sexual assault prevention and bystander intervention, turning her guilt into something that actually helped other students. I saw photos of her speaking at campus events and training peer educators, and I felt genuinely proud of how she'd transformed her shame into productive action. She still struggled with what she did to Rachel, she told me in a late-night text. But at least now she was doing something useful instead of just feeling bad about it. Her programs reached hundreds of students, teaching them about consent and how to support survivors, and I thought about how Rachel might feel, knowing that one of her tormentors was now protecting others from similar harm. A year after that night at the lodge, I walked into a coffee shop near campus and froze when I saw Rachel sitting at a corner table with textbooks spread around her. She looked up and our eyes met, and for a second I thought about leaving, but she gave a small nod that seemed like permission to approach. I walked over slowly, my heart pounding, and asked if I could talk to her for a minute. She said okay, and gestured to the empty chair, and we had the most awkward conversation of my life. I told her I'd been volunteering and speaking at schools, and she said she'd heard about it through her victim advocate network. She told me she was thriving in her criminal justice program and planned to become a victim's helper, working with people who'd been through similar experiences. Seeing her strong and focused and purposeful made me genuinely happy, even though I knew I'd contributed to her pain, and I said so out loud. She nodded and said she was grateful too, grateful she survived and found a way to turn her trauma into something meaningful. Rachel mentioned she'd been working with lawmakers on new laws to strengthen cyberbullying protections and improve consequences for people who drug others. She explained the legislation in detail, how it would close loopholes and create better support systems for victims, and I listened to her passion for creating real change that would help countless other people. I told her I admired her strength, and I was grateful she survived what we did to her, and she looked at me for a long moment before saying she was grateful too. We didn't become friends and probably never would, but there was something like mutual respect in that moment, an understanding that we were both trying to move forward in different ways. 2 years later, I was finishing my degree in social work with a focus on helping people make amends for harm they've caused, and I'd made speaking about my experience a regular part of my life. I talked at high schools, colleges, community centers, anywhere people would listen, always being completely honest about my role as someone who stood by and let cruelty happen. I explained how bystanders enable bullies, and how one person speaking up can change everything, and I saw the message landing with audiences who needed to hear it. Some people thanked me afterward, others looked at me with disgust, and I accepted both reactions because I deserved them. My professors knew my story, and several of them used me as a case study in their classes about change and accountability, and I let them, because if my mistakes could teach others something useful, then at least they served some purpose. One afternoon, I received an email invitation to speak at Rachel's college about bystander intervention in a criminal justice class, and the professor mentioned that Rachel herself had recommended me as a speaker. Reading that recommendation felt surreal and terrifying, knowing I'd have to stand in front of her class and tell my story while she watched. The day of the presentation arrived, and I stood at the front of a lecture hall with 40 students staring at me, and Rachel sat in the back row with her arms crossed and her face neutral. I told them everything about the ski lodge, about the cyberbullying campaign, about Henry drugging Rachel, and how I watched it happen without saying anything. I explained how my silence made me complicit in her suffering, and how I've spent years since then trying to understand the impact of my cowardice and help others avoid making the same mistakes. The students asked hard questions about why I didn't speak up and what I would do differently, and I answered honestly, even though my voice shook. After class ended, Rachel came down to the front and stood in front of me for a moment before saying, "Thank you for being honest with her students." She said they needed to hear from someone who'd actually failed as a bystander so they'd understand the real consequences, and I nodded because I knew this was as close to anything good between us as we'd ever get. I realized standing there that this was as close to redemption as I was ever going to reach, and maybe that was exactly what I deserved. Not forgiveness or absolution, but just the chance to help prevent others from making my mistakes.